It says that your book here, Internet Success, a study of open source software commons, analyzed, this has got to be a misprint, 170,000 projects?
Yeah, I'll be talking about this a little bit, right.
Oh, we're going to be here a long time, folks.
I'm going to talk about each one.
Okay, well, if you're going to talk about 170 research projects, I better shut up and get out of here. So welcome. We're looking forward to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much. But that was the most unusual and fun introduction I've ever encountered. Nice job. I'm Charlie Schweik, and it's really a great, fantastic honor for me to be here. The intellectual people in this room are just fantastic, and so many people here have influenced me in one way or another. It's just really an honor. Let me make sure this works. I wanted to bring this up, Yokai. I can't tell you how many times, and the paper, ANN-SONIC-NICO, that you guys have produced, it says this. I can't tell you how many times over the past 2 years I've referenced this passage. As I was introduced, for those who don't know me, and I think a lot of you don't, I have a computer science background. That was my undergraduate degree. I was a programmer at IBM for about 7 years. I went on and got a master's of public administration at Syracuse University, then went on and eventually got a PhD in public policy at Indiana University, working with Eleanor Ostrom, political scientist, political economist, studying common property regimes in environmental areas. And what I was doing back in the mid-90s was trying to tie my computing background at the time, this was geographic information systems and remote sensing and land cover change, to study forest and deforestation in countries like Nepal, but then tying it to the social science on the ground, trying to understand incentive structures, actors, how they were behaving, and then how it was manifesting itself on land cover change using satellite imagery. So during that period, I learned a lot about the theory, the more than 40 years or more theory about common property regimes and in the environmental and the natural resource context, so forestry, irrigation systems, fisheries, and those types of things. And then around 1998, roughly, I first heard the language free, Libre, and open source software. And I had one of those light bulb moments, and for the young scholars in the room, this was one of the moments that sometimes you hit in your life where you suddenly realize this is a big idea, it's an important idea, and suddenly you totally change potentially your research track, and that's what ended up happening to me. I ended up kind of giving up on the land cover change because I was realizing at that time that the innovations of copyleft were so much bigger potentially than just open source software, and this was open source software teams were online commons-based peer production is the language I'm using now, that the common property regimes. And so I realized that I could, what I wanted to do at that point was then try to take the theory and the empirical work that I had been doing in the environmental area and connect it to this emerging phenomenon that we were seeing with open source software. And so that's what I've spent the past decade doing, and I'm continuing to do. And as I'm going to show you in the second part of the talk, that I've now started to move into other commons-based peer production systems, and that relates to Jeff's talk previously. So, but what I wanted to do was, so this is a screenshot of the book that came out after working a lot of the decade in the 2000s. What I want to do is give you a summary of some of the key empirical insights that I came to from that study. So I'm going to describe that study a little bit, and I apologize for the folks in the room that know the study, but I thought for this audience it was important to reflect on this. And then I'm going to actually talk about 3 cases where I'm on the ground actually participating in commons-based peer production and open educational resources and also open source science and hardware. And then I'm going to close with a couple reflections on things that I think are important research questions that I'm puzzling over. It's interesting to me, I'm not a network theorist or a communication scholar, so I don't know what degree they may resonate with you folks, but I definitely saw connections to Jeff's talk preceding mine. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do now in about 20 minutes is go through some of the findings that I've had from this study. So let me just describe the study. So I worked very hard with my team of collaborators on coming up with a measure of success, and what I mean by that is successful collaboration, ongoing collaborations in open source software, or a measure of abandonment of these projects. And that took us a long time. It took us at least a year and a half to come up with what we thought we had a good measure of it. And fortunately, and Kevin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at some point after we published this, a student of Kevin's, Andrea Wiggins, and Kevin actually, to a certain extent, or it appeared to me that you replicated our results largely in that paper. Correct me, you're puzzling. Yeah. Okay. So there may have been some things, but I, at least from that paper, took some felt like, okay, we're in the right direction with the measure. So I'd actually like to talk to you later about what I may be missing there. So we've got this measure. The question that we were looking at was what factors influence project success and abandonment. And so from that, I dug into, at the time, a bunch of different literature from things like social engineering, of course, the environmental common property literature, and others. And that ultimately led to something like 40 different hypotheses or sub-research questions that we were trying to look at in this study. What I'm showing here is a graph. So the woman I worked with, as I said, is Eleanor Ostrom, who was a commons scholar. And in her community, this is a framework that she used for a lot of her work. I, of course, used it in my own work. There's lots of people that have used this. And it just helps me think about the situation that we're studying. And so the focus for me is in that center part, this open source developer. And they're in an action situation, meaning that they're trying to decide whether to stay or go, type of thing. And that decision, this is a dynamic system, but in that decision juncture, there are buckets of attributes. So these technological attributes, these community attributes, meaning human community, and then institutional attributes, meaning the rule systems, the governance systems that were guiding the projects. That in particular, as an institutional analyst, that was what I was really interested in. And I've got to say, when I first dove into this, I think I was a little naive, because if you think back at 2004, 2005, maybe a little preceding that, the open source literature that was out there, there was a lot of hype about Linux and Apache web server and these big projects, these massive projects, and that's what we were really reading about and hearing about. And at that time, people, that's really the kind of information you hear about. So I went into this thinking that the governance structures in some of these projects would be more complicated than ultimately we found. But so this framework kind of guided the way I thought about the project. We ended up coming up with a longitudinal, thinking about projects in terms of successful collaborations or abandonment. This graphic just shows, a couple of the standard trends. So if you think about Linux or some of the big ones, they would take that arrow 1, starting small and then growing over time with a larger team of developers and a larger team of users. But there's also the trajectory of small teams where they start small and they continue to stay small. So that's that line 3 in the graphic. And then you have the abandoned kinds of projects that take the number 2 line. But the other thing is we were looking at 2 stages. So we called it the initiation stage and the growth stage. The initiation stage was really the pre-first release, and the growth stage was the post-first release stage. So we looked at these projects along these two time periods in our study. So the data set in the introduction, so we actually had a data set from 2006 that was complements of Kevin's group of the floss mole group at Syracuse. And then in 2009, we got another data set that had 174,000 projects in it. And so what we ended up doing, I'm synthesizing a lot here, but what we ended up doing was setting up coding forms for these cases where we had these variables that we thought we wanted to measure. And we went through the SourceForge, which is the hosting repository that this data set came from. And we were mapping the actual metadata about the projects to these concepts. Where we didn't have data in that metadata, we augmented this with a survey of SourceForge programmers, and we actually got the SourceForge community to allow us to send it out to their whole entire community, which was amazing. And the result of that was 1,400 project survey responses. And what we were getting there were things that obviously weren't in the metadata of the projects. So things like the governance systems were part of what we asked for, and also things about motivations and other things. So what I'm summarizing here now are really some of the big results I kind of took from this work. So one of them is what I call a theory of compound incentives. So I'm flagging Kevin a lot, but I know tomorrow he's got a paper on motivation, so I'm really interested in hearing what he's going to say about this. The theory of compound incentives, what I'm trying to get at there is a lot of the literature in the early days were talking about these different motivations. And some of them are, the one that we found that was really across the board, the reason why people are participating in these was what Eric von Hippel calls user-centered need. So they're really motivated because they're using the software, or I would argue their employers are using the software, and I couple that in both user-centered need in both of those situations. The pay motivation, of course, comes into that second point about employers. There's a sociologist named Stevens who talks about serious leisure, and that concept is the idea that somebody may have skills, programming skills, but is maybe dissatisfied at work with what they're doing, and so they start contributing to something that they feel like more meaningful. So if you think of like the crisis mapper folks, they may be people that are like in that situation. Of course, the openness philosophy, the idea of learning through reading code, these are all motivations that as we analyzed our data, they came out. Although the user-centered need was really the key one. The one that a lot of the literature in the mid-2000s were talking about were demonstrating skill. Doing to try to showcase your skill to a community that's important. And that to us actually kind of dropped out because the vast majority of these projects are very small. And so there really isn't a huge community involved to even showcase your skill. But the last thing I'll say about this point is that what we found looking at the motivations from our surveys is that the successful collaborative projects, the people that were working there tend to have more than one of these motivations. And that's why I call it a theory of compound incentives, that the successful collaborative projects tended to have people that were motivated for more than one reason. And I thought that was quite interesting. The second one that I'd like to reflect on is the governance and institutional designs of open source software common-based peer production projects and their overarching nonprofit foundations. So in this, in the IAD framework that I showed you, Ostrom and others have got a fairly sophisticated way of thinking about governance structures. And it breaks down generally in operational, collective choice, and constitutional. Constitutional might totally make sense to you. Things like the open source license would fall under that. It may be the rules on how a new leader is replaced would fall under a constitutional level rule system. Operational is probably straightforward. It's the rules that kind of govern the way the team works, these could be formal rules or they could be social norms. And then the third, the middle level, collective choice, is really talking about the rules of who can define the operational rules. So who has a say in changing the rules? So if a team is deciding to somehow change the way something goes into the next release, who can make those rule changes? That would be an example of that. What this graphic is showing is just cut at our data classified by the successful and the abandoned growth projects. So these are the ones that are post-first release. And it's just showing the populations of developers. And it's basically showing you that the vast majority of this data set are there's not a lot of programmers, 1, 2, 3 programmers in the vast majority of these. But, this little graphic I've done, I don't know where the boundary is, but essentially in those, it won't be surprising to you that in those small teams, the governance and operational rule systems are really driven by social norms and also embedded in the collaborative system that they're using. So we actually, in an early phase of the research, we interviewed programmers, and when we asked them about operational rules or questions around that, they actually were kind of puzzled. And we had to press them for a while, and then what it came to realize is that actually most of the operational rules fall under the collaborative system that they're working in and the authorizations that their user ID has to do work. So there are operational rules in these teams, but they tend to be buried in the actual collaborative system that they're using. But then we did find statistical evidence that suggests that as these teams get bigger, they do move toward more formalized governance systems. So the bigger teams do tend to have more formalized rules, as I just said. So I don't expect you to read this or read this. This is just a table from the book, but what we were trying to do in the study is dive deeper into this, and Ostrom and others came up with a way of categorizing different rule systems. So there's things like position rules and boundary rules, and I won't go through them for time, but and these can happen at each one of those 3 levels. And so what I was trying to do in this was start to move to a more sophisticated level of studying the governance structures of these teams, following this system of categorizing or defining governance structures that have been used in the environmental commons area for quite a while. At the time, and I think this was around 2007, 2008, I was looking for some case to try to really dive into the rule systems. And the case I found was by Mahoney and Ferraro, where they describe in rich text kind of the evolution of governance in the Debian Linux project. So this very massive project, and they were describing these phases of governance. And so what we tried to do in one of the chapters of the book was describe that case using the Ostrom rule category scheme. And so we were able to do it and pull it off. And this is a snapshot of one of the tables from that. And more of the snapshot. And then ultimately, what I ended up doing as another part of this is that I was realizing, as many of you know, open source communities often have a nonprofit foundation that's an overarching foundation. The Mozilla Foundation, I think, was the first one that came out, and then there's been others. And so as I'm going to be talking about in kind of the on the ground work I'm doing now, there's an open source geospatial foundation that I've been working with. And I took the opportunity to study that nonprofit foundation and also the projects that fell under it to look at the rule systems there. And so what this graphic is showing is my attempt to start looking at these rules across projects in a more sophisticated governance setting. Now, the thing that I've come to about this, and I'm going to come back to the end of it, is that the rich description and these kinds of tables and categories are useful, but they're really unsatisfying. And so I'm going to come back to a research agenda item that I'm trying to think about, and I hope others will try to think about, so I'll come back to that. Another finding we had was about face-to-face meetings and online interaction. And for this community, this won't be surprising at all. But what we learned was that for many of these, and this was through our surveys, so that for many of these projects, the collaborators on these small teams, many of them had not met face-to-face, or they met maybe once face-to-face. And so the technologies that we're seeing now, like internet relay chat was the one that I was hearing a lot about back when we were doing this, but Skype, GoToMeeting, and these others, we all know now that actually, the literature on social capital was really saying face-to-face is absolutely needed when I was doing this work. And I don't disagree that that's really important, the face-to-face things, but we were clearly seeing a lot of these teams were actually building social capital and collaborating over time, and they rarely met, if ever, face-to-face. So that was a quite interesting finding for me. Well, there's a couple things I want to say, but the power law intellectual matchmaking hubs. I was glad we asked this question on the surveys. We asked a question saying, did your project gain a developer, yes or no? And then if they did, we asked, did your developer, the developer you gained, was it co-located geographically with you? Was it in the same city, in the same state, province, country, continent, or on another continent? And we found that something like 58% of the projects, the successful collaborative projects, actually gained a developer on a different continent. Now, this data set was largely US and Europe, so I'll say that. But to me, this was really an important phenomenon because I think we're seeing now this, what I would call, and what a political scientist named Dave Karpf calls power law hubs, these places where people go on the internet where they find other people with the same passion, interest, ability, user-centered need, and they start to talk. Sometimes this is a community member talking to a developer. Sometimes it may be just two developers. But this ultimately leads into the building of social capital, and it ultimately leads into a collaboration. And so I think the key conclusion here, well, let me just go to this slide, and then I'll say that. This kind of, I think we have in this study evidence of what I would call the conventional wisdom of open source, a virtuous circle. And essentially the story is you have one or two developers. The two developers, they begin to work together, they lead through doing, they're motivated by need, they do some kind of web marketing. This may be on the repository like SourceForge. I now wonder about GitHub and how that translates over. A user community is established. The user community grows over time at a certain level. There's internet relay chat, bug tracking, web presence. The feedback, this intellectual matchmaking occurs, and then it becomes a virtuous circle. So this cycle continues. And it may not result into large teams, and it probably won't result in large teams, but this circle, it may result in a larger user community. So the overall story is really that, from what I've learned, is that open source is really not about growing large teams. It's about small groups of people, sometimes living far away from each other geographically, finding and connecting with each other who possess similar user needs, interests, passions, and all want to work on a particular software project. And over time, they build this social capital, collaborate, and perhaps grow a community. So that kind of summarizes what we found, and to you all, some of these, maybe all the points are obvious, but I think in this work, we at least have strong empirical evidence for these points to support these points that, as I said, was the conventional wisdom of open source that I was hearing, but I hadn't seen real statistical evidence to support it. Okay, so how am I on time? Okay, I'm okay. So So this quote has driven a lot of the work that I do, and at this point, I'm now actually moving to tell you. A couple people last night were asking me what I've been doing lately, and besides trying to write grant proposals, I've been actually immersed in 3 commons-based peer production groups, and I'm partially doing this because I'm a faculty in environmental conservation, and I'm trying to teach my students, because of the importance, and I guess some of this is normative that's driving this, is that this is such an important phenomenon on how humanity can work together in positive ways, that I'm trying to actually do this on the ground. And so, I've been going back and forth following this. And so what I want to describe now is just 3 cases that I've been working with on the ground. And the first one is the longest case, and I've alluded to it in the study, is this Open Source Geospatial Foundation. You can see the list of projects. And in about 2007, I became the chair of the Educational and Curriculum Group at the bottom. And at the start of this, so kind of longitudinally, it was probably about 10 faculty around the world, or that were distributed around the world, that met at one of the conferences. And what we've been trying to do is actually build an open educational repository, or OER, an educational system. And so around 2008 or 2009, we ended up putting up this web metadata system where we allow people in the community to actually put educational material they were working on and share it with the community. So it was a metadata system. And to build on one of the points from the Wealth of Networks that I've always used about task granularity, this was a fine-scale task. So in terms of the effort to put something up is much lower than actually doing more than that. And during that period, we saw a lot of actually people contributing into this commons, this common database. And part of this also is Eric Raymond's, the open source evangelist talks about rules as frictions. And so one of the things we were trying to do is really keep the rule systems down. But then the next step, and this gets into Jeff's talk, is that since then, I've been trying to lead this community in a remixing effort. And it's been a very, very difficult process. I haven't been, it's a nut I haven't been able to crack. And we had a lot of effort in 2008-9 where we were now starting to bring in rules. There was dialogue with some that said we have to formalize the actual educational material to have, certain formats to the way the material would be put in. And others like me were saying that's putting rules and it's going to be a friction and people won't participate and we shouldn't do that. I was pushing for something like, well, let's at least go with a common format, just simply open office. Other people were saying, let's use LaTeX and other systems. And it's been a very difficult challenge. I think the one thing that, connecting back to the previous speaker, the modularity question, at one point I looked at MIT Open courseware and I looked at Rice Connections, and we were definitely moving toward the Rice Connections model at the time because it was modular, and MIT Open courseware was all the full course material. So we were moving in this kind of modular direction. But then since then, it's been kind of idle, and it gets into leadership questions at some point on my back, but a new energetic guy came in. We rebranded, and we now have this community called Geo for All, which is the education. So it was kind of pushing the openness and education effort. And just in the span of a year, we now have 104 labs all over the world. We're not even marketing it. It's just we're getting all sorts of people wanting to join in. So it's a very interesting time. And the last thing I'll say about this is that we're now moving into modules in terms of focused effort. So there's a group that's formed now that's on urban vulnerability and geospatial technologies, and another group that's interested in volunteer geographic information and citizen science. And now we're seeing actions going on. And it was interesting because I hadn't heard of Jeff's, the climate collaborative. that's exactly what's starting to emerge now, is this group is starting to talk about sharing proposals and going after different things globally. So it's a very interesting time that's occurring currently. Okay, the second case I'd like to talk about is publiclab.org, and I don't know if you've heard of these guys, but it's the Public Laboratory of Open Technology and Science. And this group started at the Gulf oil spill, and what essentially they were trying to do was, it's an activism, it's an environmental justice type of group, and what they were trying to do was, as the Gulf oil spill was happening, they were trying to get information about where the oil was spilling, and they couldn't get it from the government agencies that had imagery. And so they said, heck with it, we're going to fly our own. So they came up with this open, low-cost citizen science project where they flew cameras off of kites and they mapped the Louisiana coast. This is actually a student of mine flying their helium balloon model with a camera hanging from it while we were doing invasive species mapping, trying to use the same technology. This is a graphic of the Gulf oil spill, some of the imagery they caught, and showing where they were trying to keep the oil from spilling or getting to shore, and their images were capturing where all the tar was getting on the shore. This is actually me and another guy flying the balloon, capturing water chestnut and invasive species using their technology. Public Lab's now moved to other hardware. So they're now looking into water pollution, and they're coming up with like small, low-cost devices. Part of their goal is to get devices that can be used worldwide at very low cost. So this is a light spectrum technology that they're trying to develop. But what's interesting here is what they've developed is a collaborative system that they call research notes. And so basically you can go online. This is a platform they've developed from scratch. And you can post research notes on what's going on. And it's an interesting issue because, again, linking back to Jeff, what's happening now is that the growth of the community since 2012, the blue line is actually showing the grand total people on their listserv. The red line is their primary listserv, so they've got a lot of sub-projects. But they've got a growth in community. They're almost around approaching 5,600 people on these lists. And one of the problems of going back, one of the issues that's happening now is there's so many research notes that it's getting information overload, and it kind of relates back to what Jeff was talking about. And you were talking about the search mechanisms, the importance of search mechanisms. And that's exactly the conversation that's going on right now in a new derivative of this, this collaborative system of how to get it so that you can find things and tracks better. I think I've covered everything I wanted to say there. Yeah, the clutter and the visibility in search is a challenge. The third one, and I don't know if you heard, I think TED Radio Hour last Friday, a week ago, but they actually interviewed these guys. This is the Open Rove. It's an open source research submarine. And this started, I think, about 2 years ago. So OSGeo was the longest community. Public Lab's been around for about 5 years or more, and now this one's more brand new in the scale of kind of the trajectories. But several of my students were interested in doing this, and so I've got a couple fish ecology faculty, and we went to the Maker Faire in New York City and met these guys, and so we ended up buying their open source piece of equipment. It cost $1,000 even though it was open source, and it wasn't put together. And so my computer scientist and an engineer worked. The idea was, according to the video of how this should be put together, it should have been a weekend. It ended up taking us a year to build it. So we were a little misled on that. And it's rather funny about that. Well, it'll bring me to a point about this. But they've now moved to, again, a commons-based peer production around the research that's going on. This is their kind of similar thing to the research notes in Public Lab, with communities using this all over the place. Just for fun, I thought I'd show you a couple pictures of a fish that the robot caught for my students. But the issue here, the issue that I ran into we've run into with the Open Rove community is that we ran into a hardware issue in the build, and the students, it was a soldering problem, and it was a very small, minute problem, and it took them 3 months to resolve it, and this is not something that could be easily resolved through the online community. So it's an interesting challenge as we move into the open source software kind of ways of collaborating into open hardware. So the reflections, I just want to say that as I've been participating in these communities, I've been reflecting on what I learned in open source. And the generic thing, just for time, that I'll just say is that largely the things I reported to you earlier seem to be playing out in what I'm seeing in these communities. The one I'll mention is the power law intellectual matchmaking, which for me, if you remember back to that image of the canoe with the water chestnut, we were grappling with how to actually identify the invasive species in that canopy. And we were talking through through Public Labs research notes about this problem. There were like 2 of us. So picture the open source software, 2 developers talking in an open forum with lurkers. And we were talking about what we were doing with this. And we had a lot of people. We could see the people watching, reading our research notes. So we knew we had people watching. And at some point, a remote sensing guy who had been lurking chimed up and said, I think I can solve your problem. Can I get your imagery? So we gave him the imagery, and what he was trying to do was actually do textural analysis of the canopy to try to pull out the vegetation. It didn't work, but it was an awfully cool on-the-ground experience of what this intellectual matchmaking we've discovered. I will say also on the education front, my students have been posting research notes as they work on projects, and I've had one student who posted something, and the next day she had 100 people looking at it, and 2 people were actually commenting on the work she was doing. So through the classes I've been doing, we're actually my students are participating in these online peer production networks, and I think it's a hugely important area for education at this point. So what I want to close with now is just a couple puzzles or possible commons-based peer production research agenda items. So, I think I've already said that I'm not a network scholar, so I don't know to what degree this resonates with the network folks, but hopefully there's some interesting insights from the group. The first one, which won't surprise you based on what I showed about the book and the study of governance, is how do we study the structure and evolution of commons-based peer production governance in a more systematic fashion than just, and that permits quantitative analysis. How do these institutions evolve? And you know, as I showed you, I tried to categorize these things, and it's I've mentioned a lot of the stuff already that I wanted to say here. The things about the embedded nature of rules in the systems, but one of the questions I've been moving toward. And of course, I've been greatly influenced by Eleanor Ostrom and her work, but what she was doing when I was a graduate student that I didn't really quite realize the importance of what she was doing is she wrote a paper with Sue Crawford. I don't know if anybody has read this paper, but it's called The Grammar of Institutions. And what she was trying to do was actually come up with a syntax for the way you write out rules. And as I said, as a graduate student, I didn't quite get what she was getting at and now I get it. We need some kind of grammar to allow us to articulate rules in such a way that the tools that many of you guys use can read those rules in a way and analyze those rules in a way that we're not just comparing rich text and these kind of tabular comparisons like I've done. If anybody knows of anybody who's doing this kind of work, I do know that since that paper came out, there's now a group of nonprofit scholars who have now picked it up and are actually looking at the governance of nonprofits just recently in the past 3 or 4 years that have started to try to use this grammar. The struggle I had with the grammar was the grammar is very, very complex. And so the other question I've had about this is, to what level of granularity do we need to understand rule structures? To what degree of resolution do we need to describe these rules and how they evolve? But this is, I think, a really important research agenda item. The second one, big puzzle, which I know many of us are probably puzzling about, is the research on the financing side of commons-based peer production. So how are these organizations financing themselves? I've actually had an idea of a proposal to look at makerspaces and makerspace networks and try to do an inventory around those with a specific look on how they're actually financing those communities. But recently, as part of the OSGeo effort, and some of you here may know much more about this than I do, but this really caught my eye, this whole idea of B corporations, these for-profit corporations, this new tax code that I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe came out around 2012 in the US, and I believe there's about 30 states that have something like this in place. But this is a situation where you have companies that now are taking on a social enterprise or a social mission, and this particular company, if you dive down and you look at some of the actual human resource information he has, they're hiring and they've got information about how they treat their employees. 10% of their time, they actually allow their employees to contribute back to the commons. So they're actually participating in open source geospatial software that's a common property peer production system. And so I think this kind of model might be very interesting, and I don't know if anybody's looked at this, but I think, when we go back to the first slide where governance and management are separated from property and contract, the idea of these kinds of organizations where they're contributing, I think is really important. I know we have others, like I know in my campus with the Moodle community, we have people contributing to Moodle, and on that point, I know I've actually heard that the governance has kind of gotten in the way recently in a couple of the enhancements my university's been wanting to do to Moodle, and the actual way, the operational rules on how they get into the next release. But so I think I would love to hear if anybody in the Q&A, if anybody has knowledge of new research that's being done in this area, I think I'd love to hear it. A third research agenda item for me is getting at the version control systems, because they seem to play such an important role in these online commons-based peer production communities. So, the public lab research notes system is quite different than what we've been developing in the Geo for All community. And I mean, in the open source software, there's been some standardization when they're using things like SourceForge or GitHub. But in these other communities, it's all over the place. And I think Thingiverse is another example of a system where people are using these things. And so there really needs to be some systematic studies of these systems and the functions that are with them and how people are using them. And what are their embedded operational rules? And then the last thing I'll close with is managing complexity in commons-based peer production that are a form of atoms and not bits. I don't know how many of you have seen the book by Chris Anderson. It's called Makers, the Second Industrial Revolution. Anderson is the editor of Wired. Came out a couple years ago. And he talks about the difference. He's talking a lot about the 3D printing and the distributed manufacturing that's coming, that's here. But he talks about this difference between bits and atoms. And so going back to the Open Rove situation where my students were dealing with this very complex device and having that soldering problem, it was a very difficult situation. And so as we move to these new commons-based peer production situations where you have 3D modeling, like was shown by Jeff's talk, but that are actually producing atoms, and you have people using these physical open source devices, it's a challenge on how you handle this complexity. And I've only got an indication of this now, but in the newest release of the Open Rove, they are now selling their open source version 4 system already packaged. And so they've now moved into a situation where they're becoming more of a seller of the product. That I think you can buy it to build it, but they've realized that this is a difficult build. And what's interesting in Public Lab, one of the technologies I didn't talk about, which is an Arduino-based water monitoring, water pollution device called the Riffle. I had students trying to build that Riffle and use it last year. And this year, I have other students trying to do this. And the developer of that in Public Lab has said, well, it's probably would be better for me to build it and send it to you. So there's this interesting phenomenon that's occurring with complexity in the atoms world that's different than the bits world in common space peer production. So it's an era I think we're going to see more and more about. So with that, I think I'm just about on time, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have two comments. One is that you asked about how can we analyze the governance of common-based peer production from quantitative kind of analysis. First, I think we still need a lot of work in terms of what governance means in common-based peer production. You did a good work, I think, but still we need, I think we need to advance into understanding the complexity of it, on building upon on the work of Ostrom, but also on the work of Manuel Castells about how power function in network structures. For a project is called peer-to-peer value, we identified 8 dimensions of governance present in common-based peer production. In which
8 dimensions?
Yes, in which I'm not going to explain it because to not get far, but in order to identify where there are positions of power in the whole process, no? And on the basis of these 8 dimensions, we try to analyze how far the governance of the cases were able to explain the capacity of the process to generate value or to be successful, if you want, in your own terms, no?
Yeah.
And for that, we built a sample of 300 cases and try to collect data connected to these dimensions of governance.
Fantastic.
And I have to say that we also analyze other type of things like sustainability or value or systems of reward. And the variable of governance was the more difficult one to actually collect data from. While for other type of aspects of the analysis, we could use scripts for collecting automatically the data from the cases, or we can collect the data from observation of them online.
Yep.
The governance dimension was the one that in which we were depending more on a survey to the cases or asking directly to the cases.
Yep.
So it's so the answer is from our experience in peer-to-peer value, we were able to analyze governance with a sample of 300 cases, but still it's very much depending on what the cases say about themselves,
okay, right.
not data that you can collect independently.
Yeah.
That's my first comment.
Can I just interject one thing there? And that gets into the question of granularity, because if you know, the difficulty of collecting rule systems through surveys or that type of thing, it's just challenging. And so, you know, trying to figure out what's the sweet spot of understanding, you know, the rule systems and not getting too granular is a challenge.
The second question is about the success in the sense of when common-based peer production, in your own study, how you define when common-based peer production did actually work, or the cases actually were successful because they were able to generate collaboration and continue over time. I think also you did a really great work, and on the basis of that, we also need to complexify more. What do we mean by when common-based peer production works? And I think on this, how we have tried to solve it in this project is by trying to understand how actually value is being generated in these processes through investigating the conception of value present in the cases and identify dimensions of value like community building, reputational, value of use, about how far the resource is being produced is being used, or this kind of things. So I think the framework of value can help us to go more complexifying about what works means or what success means.
Yeah,
no?
and no doubt there are lots of ways we could measure success of these. What I was particularly interested in was that they were continuing to work and collaborate. So I was coming at it from a collective action angle, and that's kind of the measure we were trying to capture. But you're right. I mean, there are other dimensions of this that absolutely are important.
Mm-hmm. My final comment is that considering the current state of common-based peer production, in which it's expanding a lot to many other areas of activities, like the one that you have been presented in your second part of the question, or there is also a process of hybridification in which, like for example, Uber, in which we don't know if this is common-based peer production or not, or how to establish. I think we need to really go into defining more which are the delimitation criteria of common-based peer production that help us understand what it is in contraposition to market innovation, for example. And you have pointed to, on the basis of Benkler work, you have pointed to diversity of motivations as one of the characteristics of common-based peer production, but I don't think diversity of motivation is actually a delimitation criteria. It's a good attribute of cases that are able to generate participation, but to be a good attribute doesn't mean to be a delimitation criteria, because diversity of motivation, there are in many kind of activities. Also us, like working in the university, are motivated by many kind of things. Like there are many areas in which diversity of motivation is present. It's not only characteristic of common-based peer or distinctive from common-based peer production. So I think we actually need to address this debate about what is distinctive.
Well, if I could just come back to that, and I don't know if Yoka has some thoughts. I'm sure he does. I've been trying to figure out how do what encompasses this, but this particular paper. And I don't know if this is an edited book, I think. I don't know if there's anything that's come out after this, but this to me was a really useful start to try to define it. And the way I see these points is that the separation of governance and management from property and contract is key. And I think what Yokai was trying to get with the diverse motivations is that those organizations, whether it be a government agency, university, a private individual, a B corporation, they have diverse motivations that are contributing to this common property regime. And so that's how I've interpreted it. So it's an element of it. There are certainly other places where there's diverse motivations, but it's the package of these three things that, to me, kind of starts to bound what a commons-based peer production is. But I'd love to hear from the expert and what he thinks, since he wrote that paper, or some of his colleagues. But anyway, I don't know if that.
No, happy that someone's over here. It's good, Brian.
So I'm kind of interested in something I know. So this slide you had, you started with, you say peer production is the most significant organizational, this is a quote from wherever, innovation. But then many of the things you're talking about are very, very solid, very, very consistently seen principles, really, of human organization. I mean, and this is why Ostrom's work is so powerful, is that it's not just this.
Right.
To what degree do you think that these things are perhaps coming, they're certainly more visible to researchers than they have been in the past. It's possible that we can do them over geographic distances that we couldn't do them over before, but the National Chrysanthemum Foundation organization which it used to have 3,000 members internationally and is down to 700. There's an article in the Washington Post, was all about this. It was breeding chrysanthemums, and it's 150 years old. So to what degree do you see this as a fundamental organizational innovation that we couldn't do before versus a organizational innovation that we now can understand in ways that we couldn't before and perhaps apply it in new areas?
Well, so I mean, one of the things when I was grappling with this, and then I read, I'm sorry, okay, I'm pulling your stuff out so much, but you know, when I read The Wealth of Networks and some of the other papers talking about open source as the quintessential instance of commons-based peer production, you know, that was really striking to me because I was coming to that conclusion as well with the innovation of copyleft. But then when I was really early on in this study, interestingly, I found somebody in my campus said, you got to look at this dissertation on the Springfield Armory in the 1800s and the construction right in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And the dissertation was an economics dissertation, and it was talking about how the Armory had been innovating in the creation of machines to fabricate bullets. And they wanted standardization of bullets. And so what they were doing back then was actually sharing the engineering designs of these around the country to other places that were building these things. And so this dissertation was actually an example of, you know, what we're talking about back in the day when you didn't have the communication networks you had. So I totally agree with that a lot of this stuff has you know, been around forever, or been around for a long time. Not forever, perhaps, but the reason why the most significant organizational, or one of the most significant organizational innovations to me, has to do with the separation of governance and management from property and contract, where you now have, and it is leveraged totally by the online environment. You now have these situations where you can have intellectual power law hubs bringing two people from two parts of the world who then are being able to build social capital and collaborate. And it doesn't have to be big teams. And that's where I think, to me, is the striking thing, coupled with, you know, the way you now have organizations that may have very diverse motivations, but are all trying to participate in this common property regime. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but anyway.
Talked him into it. Somehow I doubt that wasn't a question where there's one.
I feel like I need to take some of the pressure off you. Couple of different things. The enormously intellectual, influential work of the Ostrom School of Common Studies did much of its work at the peripheries of the global industrialized economy. One of the things that is critically new about what we're seeing on the net is that some of the very, very core, most advanced economic activities competing directly with the most sophisticated companies in the world is done an organizational model that, as of 1996, if anyone argued that they would work, would be laughed out of the room. So the idea that Microsoft thinks that its critical next generation piece of software is the web server, and a bunch of people out are saying, well, let's patch up the thing we have here, and nobody's going to own it, and nobody's going to control it, and maybe later on we'll build a foundation around it, and that the two will compete, would have simply been laughable. So in that regard, a radical innovation. Now, is it new that that people are social beings? No. Is there a deep, rich literature within the social network literature itself? I mean, Woody Powell wrote Markets, Hierarchies, and Networks before we had a clear sense of internet-mediated social practice. Of course not. But it's not just the visibility but the scope and scale of the effect on the economy and the direct competition with other more traditional firms is new. And I will just say, I said it's the most significant organizational innovation that has emerged from internet-mediated social practice. I'm not talking about Gore lattice management. I'm not talking about Toyota production system. I'm not talking about Taylorism. It's big enough to be that.
Are we time-wise?
Yeah, we should probably either should we wrap up now? I think it's quite
I just know somebody else was scheduled right now, so I don't want to take their time.
All right. Well, we will wrap it up right now. And thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.